All right, guys, welcome back to Two Miserable Presidents. Today we're going to look at Chapter 2, which is John Brown Lights a Fuse. So this is part of your Day 3 NTI instruction. So what you're going to want to do before you kind of listen to me read, make sure you have taken a chance to look over the vocabulary that's going to be in this next chapter. You also want to pay attention and look over the important people and places that's going to come up. And then, as I did with the first chapter, you may want to go ahead and flip over to Day 4. In Day 4, you'll see the questions for this chapter, and I would encourage you to go ahead and get a piece of paper to answer those questions so that you're not waiting to do everything until tomorrow. So I would go ahead and have those things ready in front of you because we will be able to answer the first 3 questions just based on your reading for today. So the second chapter actually starts on page 23, and it looks like this, okay? And it is John Brown Lights a Fuse. So that's where we're going to start today. So on page 23, here we go. John Brown Lights a Fuse. John Brown was in Kansas to fight slavery. When his emotional abolitionists heard about the attack on Lawrence, he became considerably excited, witnesses said. And when he learned of the beating of Senator Sumner, he went crazy. Brown told his small band of supporters to sharpen their swords and grab revolvers and rifles. They set out after dark, as Brown put it, to strike terror in the hearts of the pro-slavery people. Blood flows in Kansas. John Brown was 56 years old and the father of 20 children. 20 children. He had spent much of his adult life helping slaves to escape and starting businesses that failed. He was sued 21 times, usually for not paying his debts. Now he and his sons were in Kansas, determined to win this land for their cause of freedom. After the attacks on the town of Lawrence and the head of Sumner, John Brown decided it was up to him to get revenge on pro-slavery forces in Kansas. Something must be done to show these barbarians that we have rights too, he said. I hope you will act with caution, said a Free Soil man. Caution? Caution, sir. I am eternally tired of hearing that word caution. It is nothing but the word of cowardice. So on May 24th, 1856, just before midnight, John Brown knocked on the door of the cabin of a pro-slavery settler named James Doyle. Behind Brown stood 4 of his sons and 3 other men, all with guns and swords. What is it? Asked James Doyle from inside the cabin. Brown said he needed directions to a neighbor's house. But when Doyle opened the door, Brown charged inside, announcing himself as the Northern Army and demanding the surrender of Doyle and his family. Doyle's wife, daughter, and 3 sons jumped out of bed to see what was going on. Brown ordered Doyle and his 2 older sons, ages 20 and 22, to step outside. He left the rest of the family inside. Brown's men marched Doyle and his 2 sons about 100 yards down the dark road, threw them on the ground, and cut their heads open with swords. Brown and his crew visited other cabins that night, killing 2 more pro-slavery men and leaving their sliced-up bodies in the dirt. When the bodies were found the next morning, it was the South's turn to be furious. War! War! Declared a Missouri newspaper, the pro-slavery paper in Kansas calling the killings an abolitionist outrage and demanded immediate revenge. Pro-slavery forces went on the attack, burning free soilers' cabins, stealing their horses, and searching for John Brown. Free Soil armies struck back, and all-out war erupted in Kansas, or as newspapers now called it, Bleeding Kansas. More than 200 men were killed in Kansas in 1856, and the issue of slavery was still far from settled. So at this point, you could probably pause the video and go ahead and answer question number 1 for this chapter. Dred Scott denied. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., the Supreme Court was about to give the North and South something else to fight about. Here are the facts of the case. A black man named Dred Scott was enslaved, owned by a white army surgeon from Missouri, Dr. John Emerson. In the 1930s, Emerson had taken Scott with him to a few army bases in Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, areas where slavery was illegal. In 1846, Scott had sued for his freedom from John Emerson's wife, Irene, because John had recently died. Scott told the judge that he had lived for years in a free state and free territory, and therefore he should be free. Believing that under this state of fact, that he is entitled to his freedom, he prays your honor will allow him to sue said Irene Emerson in said court in order to establish his right to freedom. After more than 10 years in court, Scott's case reached the United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney of Maryland was a proud defender of the South and saw this as his big chance to strike a blow for Southern rights. Maybe his last chance. He was 80 years old. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was still a slave. Why? Because blacks were not citizens of the United States, wrote Chief Justice Taney, and they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. In other words, Scott had no right to bring his case to court in the first place. But since he had, Taney went on to rule that there should be no free territory because Congress has no right to ban slavery in territories. Slaves are property, Taney said, and the government cannot tell citizens where they can and cannot take their property. Southern slave owners cheered that their rights had finally been protected, but the opponents of slavery were shocked and scared too. What next? Would the Supreme Court rule that slavery was legal everywhere in the United States? This would be a great time to pause and answer question number 2. Senator Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was one of many Northerners upset by the Dred Scott decision. To Lincoln, the court's decision demonstrated that supporters of slavery had too much power in the national government. He planned to help change that. I have really got it into my head to try to be a United States Senator, he told his friends. His wife, Mary, agreed that Abe could be a senator. She only wished that he would act like one. Lincoln had the embarrassing habit of answering the front door in his slippers. And he wore baggy, sloppy clothes and a tall black hat in which he kept notes and letters. One day, some kids knocked off Lincoln's hat and his important papers fell out and scattered all over the sidewalk. As Lincoln calmly bent down to gather the papers, the laughing kids jumped onto his back. That was Lincoln. He just wasn't a fancy guy. Born in a tiny log cabin in Kentucky in 1809, Lincoln had spent only about a year in school. He made up for this by reading every book that he could get his hands on. He even stuck books in his pockets before going out to field the plow. As 12-year-old Abe explained, "The thing I want to know, it's in books. My best friend is the man who'll get me a book that I ain't read." The Lincoln family moved to Indiana and then on to Illinois. By the time Abe turned 18, he was 6 feet 4 inches tall, with long limbs, hard rock from years of farm work. "He can sink an axe deeper into wood than any man I ever saw," a friend said. He was also unbeatable at wrestling. When he was 23, Lincoln decided to run for the Illinois state legislature. He traveled around Sangamon County talking to voters and wrestling many of them. On election day, he came in 8th. Lincoln ran again 2 years later and won. He was a natural politician, the kind of guy who could walk into a room full of strangers and have everyone cracking up in a few minutes. But he had another side, a quiet and gloomy side. He sometimes sat still for hours, staring silently into the air. "I never saw a more thoughtful face," a friend said of Lincoln. "I never saw so sad a face." By the time he was 50, Lincoln had served in the state government and the United States House of Representatives and had become a successful lawyer in Springfield, Illinois. But he had a bigger dream: to return to Washington, D.C. as a U.S. Senator. And he got his chance in 1858 when the Republican Party announced Abraham Lincoln is the first and only choice of the Republicans of Illinois for the United States Senate. Who were the Republicans? The answer requires a brief word about political parties. At this time, there were 2 main political parties in the United States: Democrats and Republicans. Just like today, Democrats and Republicans fought over all kinds of issues. But it was the issue of slavery in those Western territories that caused the bitterest debate. The new Republican Party had been founded in 1854, and it's opposed to the expansion of slavery in the Western territory. The Republicans got nearly all their support from the North. Members of the Democratic Party argued that slavery should be allowed in the territories if the white settlers wanted it. The Democrats had some supporters in the North, but they got most of their support in the South. Long Abe versus the Little Giant. Now back to Long Abe Lincoln and his 1858 Senate dreams. The man who had the job that Lincoln wanted was Senator Stephen the Little Giant Douglas. Douglas's nickname was based on 2 things. He was little, just over 5 feet, and he had the powers of a giant in Congress. Douglas, who was a Democrat, knew Lincoln would be a tough opponent. "You have nominated a very able and very honest man," he told a Republican friend. "I shall have my hands full." Lincoln opened the contest with an alarming prediction. The North and South were speeding toward a dangerous showdown. "A house divided itself cannot stand," Lincoln said. "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become an all one thing or all the other." The only way was to prevent northern states from becoming slave states, Lincoln argued, was to stop the expansion of slavery right now. Douglas thought this was ridiculous, and he said so over and over when the 2 candidates met in a series of famous debates all over Illinois. Lincoln and Douglas argued for 3 hours at a time before huge outdoor crowds. Crowds that took part in the action by laughing and cheering, and when they felt like it, yelling out insults and comments. When Lincoln took out a piece of paper to read something aloud, one person shouted, "Put on your specs!" "Yes, sir, I am obliged to do so," Lincoln said, putting on his glasses. "I am no longer a young man." That got a big laugh. Newspaper writers followed the Lincoln-Douglas debates, printing the arguments for the entire country to read. Lincoln and Douglas, both great debaters, were battling over very issues that were splitting the country apart. Douglas attacked Lincoln's ideas that the Union could not remain half slave and half free. Why couldn't it? Douglas demanded. "Let each state mind its own business and let its neighbors alone. If we will stand by that principle, then Mr. Lincoln will find that this republic can exist forever, divided into free and slave states." The obvious solution, Douglas argued, was to let voters in those Western territories decide for themselves whether or not they wanted slavery, and everyone else should just butt out. This was exactly what Lincoln refused to do. Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but he was convinced slavery was evil. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong, he said, and he was not willing to compromise on what he saw as a simple question of right and wrong. That is the real issue. That is the issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong. By the day of the election, both men were exhausted. Trying not to get his hopes up, Lincoln kept telling himself he would never win. But his wife disagreed. "Mary insists," he told a friend, "that I am going to be a senator and president of the United States, too." Lincoln laughed at this idea. "Just think of such a sucker as me as president." Well, Abe was right this time. Douglas won the election in a very close vote. Lincoln said he was too sad to laugh, too old to cry. "I now sink out of view and shall be forgotten." So it'd be a great time, since we're finished for today, to go ahead and answer question number 3. And I'll see you guys back tomorrow.